Welcome to the Workplace Wellbeing Essential Series. I'm Mari Ryan. I'm the CEO and founder of Advancing Wellness. It is my pleasure to welcome you today to this expert interview where we explore topics that impact employee well-being. My guest today is Sally Spencer Thomas. Sally is a clinical psychologist, inspirational international keynote speaker, podcaster, and an impact entrepreneur. Dr. Spencer Thomas was moved to work in suicide prevention after her younger brother, a Denver entrepreneur, died of suicide after a difficult battle with bipolar condition. Known nationally and internationally as an innovator in social change, Sally has helped start up multiple large-scale gap-filling efforts in mental health, including an award-winning campaign titled Man Therapy, and the lead author on the national guidelines for the workplace suicide prevention. Sally has held numerous leadership positions in suicide prevention organizations and won multiple awards for her advocacy work. She has a doctorate in clinical psychology from the University of Denver, a master's in nonprofit management from Regis University, and a bachelor's in psychology and studio art with a minor in economics from Bowdoin College. She's written 4 books on mental health and violence prevention, and she lives with her partner and 3 sons in Conifer, Colorado. Sally, thanks so much for being here today.
Mari, it's an honor. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, thank you. Thank you. You know, with all of that's been going on with the pandemic, we're hearing so much more in the workplace about mental well-being and mental health issues. And we both know that mental well-being is something that is a concern all the time, not just as a result of the pandemic. With the pandemic, many more people are feeling stressed, anxiety, all the changes that are taking place. And Kaiser Permanente the Kaiser Family Foundation reports that as many as 53% of U.S. adults have reported mental health negatively impacted due to worry and stress. But we also know that, all pandemic stuff aside, that in any given day or week or month or year, that many people are struggling with mental health issues, and that they may also be struggling to the extreme in some cases with feeling that they have no alternative but to end their life and have serious thoughts of suicide. And yet I find in my work with clients that so often that suicide is really not thought of as a workplace issue. So I'm really anxious to explore this with you and think about this in the context of the workplace. But before we dig into that, tell us a little bit more about how you came to make this the focus of your advocacy work and your life work.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm just so incredibly grateful to your willingness to bring these really hard topics to the forefront, because if we don't speak them, they remain invisible. So I'm very grateful for that. So yeah, as you mentioned, I have a degree in clinical psychology. I got it a long time ago. And I was one of those psychologists that after I got out of graduate school and started doing the work of counseling, I was like, I don't know that I'm a counselor. I really loved learning about it, but I'm not sure I have the right personality to be in a room all day. And so that again worked me through a couple of other career options, health and wellness, and then leadership development, which I loved. And it was about 2004 that it was when my brother died by suicide that I had a calling. I woke up to the fact that there was some really important gaps that needed to be filled, and that we needed some innovation to fill those gaps so that people weren't falling through the cracks. One of the insights that came out of that incredibly horrible, tragic life experience that I gained was that there was a large group of people, men in the middle years primarily, that were representing the majority of suicide deaths. Most of them had never reached out for mental health services ever. They had one attempt and it was fatal. And that seemed like a really important gap to fill. And so it wasn't long after that we learned about that we said, well, the workplace, there might not be reaching out to our healthcare system, but most of them are working or just working or looking for work. Like it's the workplace that is the system that's going to be intersecting with them. And that's got us eventually to develop these national guidelines for workplace suicide prevention, which is a collaborative national program supported by many, many large scale organizations.
Well, Sally, I'm so sorry that you had to have this life experience in order to help you find your calling. But many people will benefit as a result of your commitment to this topic. And I find it so interesting that the workplace has ended up being the container, the system where you're able to have some impact. But I'm curious, you mentioned in particular men and working men. Are they a particular risk group? Are there other particular risk groups that we should be aware of?
Yeah, so I just want to make clear that when we look at the death data, about 80% of people who die by suicide are male. But when we look at the attempt data, the overwhelming majority are women. So it's not that women have less despair, it's just that they're
Mhm.
much more likely to live because they use less lethal means.
Okay.
But because we have better data on death data, because not everybody reports their attempt or it doesn't show up in
Right.
places where we're counting,
Right.
we can now rank industry by suicide rate. And that was a
Mm.
critical turning point. The CDC started to come out with reports in 2016. They now have had 3 reports that have come out. And that was a galvanizing experience because now people
Mm.
could look at really credible data and say, oh my gosh, we need to do something about this, where before it wasn't even on the radar. And so there are certain industries that are more at risk, and they're all or most male dominated industries like construction, extraction, which is oil and gas and mining, transportation like rail and trucking and air, um, uh, protective service, first responders, all of those kinds of industries are really leaning in now because they've woken up to
Mm.
this experience. But there's a lot of other industries that have a better gender balance that are also paying a lot of attention right now. Obviously, the healthcare system,
Yeah.
that was true even before COVID hit. It's even more true now.
Right.
The service industry, restaurants, theaters, all of these industries have been really hit hard by the
Mm.
pandemic, and they were already vulnerable before this started.
So interesting that it's so fabulous, of course, that the data is able to really substantiate and be able to help us focus the concern in those industries, because that way at least they can start to be addressed as perhaps an industry problem or within specific employers or organizations within industry. So that's really, really exciting to hear. I'm curious, are there any risk factors or signs? So this is not just men, it's women as well. Are there any signs that we should be looking for? What are the things that we should, as individuals and as managers and as leaders in organizations, be watching for?
Yeah, and I'll use the pandemic as part of the example of my answer, just because it's so top of mind for people. And the pandemic has raised mental health concerns in the workplace to a much higher level in the consciousness of employers, and for good reason. So the pandemic is really a perfect storm of risk factors. So I'll start there.
Mm.
Risk factors that would increase someone's chances of having suicidal thoughts or behavior are things like isolation,
Mhm.
things like job loss or financial disruption, things like relationship disruption. And when you put all those together on top of this huge fear of uncertainty, fear of our health and well-being, like that is a real huge perfect storm of risk. And then layer on all of our natural disasters and social unrest, like it's no wonder that we're starting to see the warning signs now show up. And this happened pretty close out of the gate. You mentioned people reporting to Kaiser about increased concerns about anxiety and depression. But we're also seeing other things that we can measure, like increased alcohol sales. So one of the warning signs is that people's use of substances goes up. They don't feel well. They feel on edge. They feel despairing. They feel overwhelmed. And guess what? You know, our alcohol and drugs will numb that out for a period of time. So people start to increase that self-medication.
Right.
We're also seeing increased domestic violence calls. So violence or
Mhm.
aggression, agitation,
Yeah.
even on the lower levels of just people being really irritated all the time, flying off the handle for small provocations. Again, we often say hurt people hurt people. They don't feel
Mhm.
well. And so they see the world through kind of an antagonistic frame sometimes. And so we'll
Mhm.
see that. We've also seen increased purchases of firearms, especially around the
Mhm.
periods of unrest that we've had in over the last year. And
Mhm.
again, I want to be clear, being a firearm owner does not mean that you are more suicidal. However, if you are suicidal and you own a firearm, you're far more likely to die. So that accessibility to lethal means, the getting it, learning about it, or even doing dry runs and practice or researching things on the internet, all huge warning signs. And then people just shift their language as they become more and more despairing. And sometimes it's a subtle experience with someone where the back of the neck hair goes up. It just doesn't seem right. And we call those pieces of conversation invitations. They're actually looking to see who's picking up. And sometimes it's not even conscious, picking up how much pain that they're in. It's things like, I just don't know what the point is anymore. Or, why does this matter? Or, questions about afterlife or death, or just those kinds of things that your brain says something's not right here. It does what I call a brain wobble. Like they're trying to tell me something, but I'm not quite sure what it is. And when we have those kind of strange, provocative conversations, our inclination sometimes is to be like, nah, I misinterpreted. I'm blowing it out of proportion, or Joe's just being Joe. And what we really encourage people to do is to lean in and just ask clarifying questions and meet the person with some compassion. So I could go on all day about warning signs and risk factors, but those are some of the real highlighted ones that I think people can look at.
Those are really good. Thank you. That's important. And it's important for us to be listening and paying attention in those situations for these kinds of things. I notice in working with my clients that suicide is kind of a taboo topic. It's not something that anybody talks about. There's stigma associated with it, and especially in the workplace. How do we start to bring this into the conversation so that people really are willing to talk about it and more comfortable with it?
Well, you start by doing stuff like this, where you just talk about it in a matter-of-fact way, like we would anything else. And if you think about it, 40 years or so ago, this was the same place we found ourselves in with cancer, like, ooh, cancer. And now we're like, yeah, cancer, people have it, people live through it, get treatment for it. We celebrate our people who've survived it. We mourn the people who we've lost by it. It is part of our lives. Same thing here. And so having these matter-of-fact conversations where we're talking about it directly matters in mass communication. It also matters in one-on-one or families or systems kinds of communications. We find, again, if we take cancer as the case example, that it was the science and the stories that got us through those discriminatory, prejudice, or misinformed ideas about cancer. So same thing here. The better science that we have, the more we understand how this impacts all kinds of people all the time in various degrees. And the fact that people who live through what we call suicide intensity, thoughts and feelings about suicide, who have lived through an attempt, are just like our cancer survivors. They're heroes in their journey of overcoming something incredibly painful and difficult. And we can learn so much from their survival stories. And when they share their stories, and not everybody can, but when we hear those stories of a hero's journey through overwhelming despair, it helps so many people. It helps people see, okay, you got through it. I can get through it. You took a roadmap that makes sense to me. Now I see steps I can take. So that's really powerful. And when I think about the journey that we've had in getting workplaces on board with this, when we started in 2007, it was like banging your head against the wall. Employers would look at me like, suicide? No, like that's a medical thing. Like people need to take that up with their doctors. And I said, but they're not. And they're here and they're working. And perhaps just like you do some other health issues, you could tackle this one as well and save some lives. And it took the data from the CDC, and it took some very forward-leaning employers who said, let me be the first. I don't want this on my watch. I don't want my people despairing in isolation. Let me be the first to try this and get it right. Their stories of embracing this and the outcomes that they had from this work started to tip the scale. Now we're in a place where people are coming forward all the time saying, what can I do? How can I help our workers? How can I get in front of this or support people that have been impacted by it?
Well, so important and just wonderful to hear that people are willing to step up and they are willing to start to bring this into the conversation. And I've noticed in our conversations that you've been instrumental in developing national guidelines for workplaces on suicide prevention. Tell us about those guidelines. This sounds really exciting and great work that you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, so I serve on a couple of committees in the United States and internationally where the idea of having some handholds for employers is really important. And so we've started to look. There were other countries that had standards or position statements on this: Australia, Canada, and it was about 2015 or so. We're like, we really need a set of these in the United States.
Mm.
And so we started researching and having all kinds of focus groups with EAP people, employee assistance professionals, HR, safety professionals, people with lived experience who had had their own suicide crisis while they were working, peer support groups, and so forth, and just getting their input on what should be in these guidelines and what would be the best format for them, and so on and so forth. And so in October, on World Mental Health Day, October 10th, 2019, and by we, I mean the American Association of Suicidology, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and United Suicide Survivors International, three national suicide prevention nonprofits, we collaboratively launched these guidelines to give employers a set of guiding principles, so values, if you will, that help guide decision making, and 9 practices. So we wanted to make it very concrete. Here's 9 exact things you can do that will increase the likelihood that we can be proactive, that we can have early intervention for people who are in emerging crisis, and that we can meet people on their darkest day with our best game. It's dignity and respect and partnership. And so here we are, a little over a year later. We have over 600 pledge partners. We really encourage employers and professional associations like unions and other groups to take the pledge to make workplace suicide prevention a health and safety priority. And then once you've registered as a formal pledge partner, and again, this is all free and publicly accessible, it walks you through a series of these steps where you earn badges as you become more suicide informed. And so then you have an external facing cue to let people know, like, we take this seriously and this matters. So it's been super exciting. And again, not unexpectedly, a lot of our construction partners have leaned in just because they're well aware of the risks, but also because they're very pragmatic people. They're like, we've got a problem. How do we solve a problem? And then they dive in. So we invite people just to, even if you're not in a position of leadership where you can make all these decisions, to come in and learn a little bit more about it at workplacesuicideprevention.com.
Well, we'll find that, include that in the show notes. So thank you first for the great contribution you've made to that work and for the advocacy efforts to be able to bring that to workplaces and really encourage employers to step up and really take an active role in this. It's just so exciting. And I'm glad to hear there's some very concrete steps, because I'm all about, the concrete action. How do we get to action? So that would be my next question is, so what can employers do to support employee well-being on this topic, to create awareness for suicide prevention? Like, what are the first steps? What should they be doing?
Yeah. So we've organized the 9 practices into upstream, proactive prevention, midstream, early identification, and downstream, crisis response. Okay, so on the upstream piece, and I'll also comment, awareness is necessary, but not sufficient for change. We knew that smoking was bad for us for years and years and years before people actually started changing their behavior. So, yes, you got to get awareness, get it on the radar, and then taking action steps. So on the proactive prevention, upstream part of it, we're really looking for leadership, both formal and informal positions of leadership, to drive a culture that's all about caring. I've got your back. We look out for one another. This is why this is what we do, because it matters to our community. It matters to our mission. So all kinds of pieces under there about how you drive a caring culture. A second piece is about effective communication. You and I talked before this interview about, there's lots of language in the work of suicide and mental health that is laden with prejudicial experiences and ideas and misinformation and myths. And we just only known that language. So we just say it all the time. And how to shift our language and our communication strategy so that not only are we using empowering and dignified language, but we are also creating a roadmap for hope. This is another trap that sometimes people fall into, is they just, I say, repeat the drum of the death data. They're dying, everybody's dying, they're dying. And yes, we have to create urgency with that, but you also need to give people a communication of hope. Most people who get depression treatment are helped. The overwhelming majority of people are going to live through their suicide crisis and even grow through it. So all kinds of other types of language that give people help and hope. and so on and so forth. And another piece that's really important for us conceptually that I want to make sure that I emphasize here is that it's not all about mental health. And this is shocking for people. They're like, what do you mean it's not all about mental health? What I mean is it's not all about a broken person. Sometimes it's also about a very toxic environment. Mm-hmm. And so it's not good enough just to send all people who are despairing to counselors, because sometimes it's the workplace that is having bullying and hazing and harassment and discrimination and unrealistic expectations and trauma and not even letting their people sleep. All the counseling in the world is not going to fix that if they, consistently show up in a toxic environment. So we have some strategies for workplaces to figure out what their psychosocial hazards are and how to eliminate them or mitigate them. So that's all that top tier. The middle tier is about early identification and then connecting people to what I call a buffet of resources, because not everything works for everybody. So we want to start with self-empowerment. Just like any other health issue, you're going to be the expert on you. And if you can be mindful about when, like say, when your breathing doesn't seem right, or when you have headaches, right? If you are mindful of these things that are going on in your body, you can also be mindful of your emotional well-being. And if you can catch it early, you're in the best position to do some course correction yourself. So we have a self-empowerment piece where we help people with screening, creating their own crisis inoculation tools. So when they do hit hard times, they know exactly what to do. We also know that sometimes we're not the best judge of ourselves. And sometimes it's our peers, our friends and family members who are like, hey, you're drinking more than they used to, or hey, you look really exhausted. Are you okay? So how do we create a peer support tier, if you will, within a workplace, a cohort of individuals who are naturally inclined to be good listeners and empathic, who are then the go-to people when people are not doing well, that they can just have private, supportive conversations, and that those peer supporters can also be trusted liaisons should they need more professional support. And then also in the downstream space, we also have things like, is your EAP any good? Some of them are amazing, and some of them just went to the lowest bidder and they actually provide zero value. So knowing your mental health resources, not just a link to a website, but intimately knowing the providers, having them come on site, doing lunch and learns, developing relationships, because sometimes, especially with this real group that's reluctant to go that extra step, sometimes you got one chance. We have one chance to make a good, solid connection for that mental health journey. So you better know what you're doing. You better know what your resources are and have a relationship with a provider that you really trust. And then should there be a death or an attempt that rocks a workplace, you better have a plan on how you're going to provide grief and trauma support and then reintegrate the people most impacted.
Thank you for walking us through that model. It's great to hear that detail and to have a sense of some of the different approaches that organizations can take. And again, just fabulous work on making this happen and getting these guidelines published so that they're available to employers. Sally, if our audience wants to learn more about you and the work that you're doing, where can they find it?
It's easy. It's just my name, SallySpencerThomas.com.
Fabulous. As always, it's wonderful to spend time with you. This is such an important topic, and I'm so glad to be helping to spread the word about this and be willing to talk about it, and so grateful for all the work that you are doing.
Bless you. Thank you, Mary. I appreciate this opportunity.
Thanks.